So I'd like to welcome everyone here, and I'm very, very conscious of the incredible scale and significance of the topic. So I have been putting a lot of thought into how I present, and I've realized that if I try too hard to include everything that's in the book, I'm going to just simply fall over. And because the book is extraordinarily profound and vast in its content, and it's not really until you spend a bit of time closely looking at each paragraph's meaning that you realize how incredibly delicately and profoundly His Holiness the Dalai Lama is interweaving all the aspects of the Buddhist path to enlightenment in his presentation as he goes. And so, in other words, he's encapsulating the entire Buddhist path in this book, and presenting it through the lens of death and dying, and particularly our approach to death and dying, because this is really how I take the book. It's a manual for approaching our own deaths in a dynamic and self-empowering manner. And as we're going to be very clear today from the presentation and the content, His Holiness is saying now. We do it now. We study this book now because we need to be doing these practices now for death and dying. So it has an incredible impact on us emotionally and sort of in terms of our ideas about how we're constructing our life. So for reasons of auspiciousness, I'm going to quote several very, very beautiful poetic verses from the fifth Dalai Lama's short Lamrim text, called Lamrim Jampo Zayalong. And these are three verses extracted, not at random, but they're extracted from a much larger coherent poem. So, most people pass their life gathering ephemeral possessions that will soon be lost. They exert great effort and endure hardships for them. Yet, these things are like traces left by a bird in the sky, or like images drawn on flowing water. I think these are extraordinarily powerful, evocative images. And I've been walking around in my own sort of domestic landscape thinking like the tracks of a bird in the sky, this building like the track of a bird in the sky. And I was reading about a Greek shipwreck today off the coast of Greece that goes right back to the sort of Roman Empire, and they're discovering teeth from the soldiers who died in that boat when it was lost at sea. But they're also extracting all these extraordinary ancient sculptured treasures. But the civilizations and community in which that trade was occurring is no more than the trace of a bird's flight in the sky. So this is, very, very powerful. My life and everything I've achieved in terms of any residue or trace I leave are like the tracks of the bird in the sky, and like the figure drawn in moving water. So as we know, the figure appears for as long as we're drawing it. The moment we lift the stick, it's dispersed and gone. So I think these are very powerful. And His Holiness also says, meditate on all others as having been a kind mother to you in many past lives, and arouse a strong wind of compassion, love and compassion. Use this to sail the boat of universal responsibility that carries the weight of benefiting all living beings, and travel directly to the jewel island of omniscience. So as we all know from listening to His Holiness's discourses in this lifetime, His Holiness is always emphasizing universal responsibility. So we're being asked to sail this boat about universal responsibility ourselves in order to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of others. So His Holiness says, transcend the mind that holds self above others, not with the key of meeting harms, now with the key of meeting harms with goodness. Open the door that releases spontaneous accomplishment of beneficial happiness to both self and others. So this is the great task and the great challenge facing this sort of world of ephemeral appearances, is to actually utilize each and every transforming moment into a transformative process towards enlightenment on behalf of others. So with that, we'll do the prayers for the beginning of the session, and taking refuge and generating bodhicitta, followed by the one verse short mandala offering. I might chant these in Tibetan today. Going for refuge, generating bodhicitta. These are the standard prayers in the your prayer book. Sangye chodang soke chognam la janchu badu dagni kapsuchi dage jinsoge pesonam ki drola panje sangye drupa shog. Sangye chodang soke chognam la janchu badu dagni kapsuchi dage jinsoge pesonam ki drola panche sangye drupa shog. Sangye chodang soke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kapsuchi dage jinsoge pesonam ki drola panche sangye drupa shog. In the short mandala. Sashipoki Jushing Metog Tramri Rablingji Nidegen Padi Sangye Jingdu Mi Te Ua Idrokunam Jing La Jo Pa Shok Idam Guratna Mandala Kam Niryatayami. So having prepared our motivation for the session, I'm going to start with His Holiness's commentary. So his comment on page 40, 41 of the book, His Holiness quips. There's quite a lot of humor in this book, by the way, and it's often humor at our expense in our belief in permanence. His Holiness says, sometimes when I meet with lifelong friends, just as certain senators in countries like the United States, I greet them with my old friend, meaning that we have known one another for a long time, not necessarily physically old. But when I say this, some of them emphatically correct me. We are not old, we are long-time friends. His Holiness comments, actually, they are old. With hairy ears, a sign of old age, but they are uncomfortable with being old. This is foolish. So one might say that we enter into a deep conceit that not only will we not die, but that somehow magically, or perhaps with some convenient plastic surgery thrown in, we will remain eternally young. Dolly Parton is fabulously aware and witty on this point, and I couldn't resist quoting Dolly, who I think Dolly Parton's a marvelous public figure and inspiration, by the way. She says, but I don't want to lie about it. She was asked about, did she have some cosmetic procedures? She said, but I don't want to lie about it, so I've got to. I think sometimes it might help. Sharing that she's had a facelift, eye surgery, breast implant, liposuction, excess skin removal, lip injections, Botox, and more. Dolly said, you know, it's not like, I look so totally artificial, you know, but hopefully I'm totally real. So it's quite delightful there. She's sort of able to detach herself from her prosthetic manufactured self and still be in touch with her real feelings. So I'm not sort of having a go at cosmetic surgery, but there's a certain conceit involved, isn't there? And one might suggest a vanity. And that vanity can become quite painful and quite plaintive as both men and women cling to the vestiges of their earlier youth in a vain project of refusing to acknowledge that they're growing old. So I wanted to quote from David Reith now, who's the son of the very famous American cultural theorist Susan Sontag. And I know some of us will have come upon Susan Sontag's writings at various times. And David Reith had the great challenge of supporting his mother through repeated bouts of cancer. And she had the same form of blood cancer that I had, actually, called myelodysplasia. And she already had a number of transplants, and she was having a resurgence of the cancer. And David Reith is reflecting in his memoir, in a very moving literary memoir, because he's sort of an academic himself. And he says, there is a Jewish saying, quote, just as it is an obligation to tell someone what is acceptable, it is an obligation not to say what is not acceptable. Never for a moment during the course of my mother's illness did I think she could have heard that she was dying. Bedridden in the aftermath of her bone marrow transplant, her muscles soon so flaccid and wasted that she was unable to even roll over unaided. Her flesh increasingly ulcerated, and her mouth so cankered that she was unable to swallow and sometimes even unable to speak. She dreamt and spoke when she could speak, that is, of what she would do when she got out of hospital and once more took up the reins of her life. The future was everything. Living was everything. Getting back to work was everything. And though her mind, fuzzy from chemicals, chemo brain, as cancer patients call it, and she was often disorientated and wild-eyed, seemingly in focus and out of her head, she counted the days until she might be released. The import of this is that after her transplant, on the wall opposite her bed in her room in the University of Washington Medical Center, she insisted that we put up a sheet of paper where each day we would mark off the number of days that had elapsed since her transplant. These numbers marked the first days of her new life, she would say. Her emphasis was always on a fresh start, that the fresh start she was about to make. It was a point on which my mother was adamant. She wanted to change things. She kept telling us, those of us vigiling with her in Seattle, not to mention the doctors, not to mention the physicians' aides and nurses who would stop to talk to her. She wanted to shake things up. When she was finally able to return home to New York, my mother said she would write in a different way, get to know new people, do some of the many things she'd been meaning to do, and stop doing more of the many things that no longer gave her pleasure. She told me at one point that she was tormented by the amount of time she had wasted during her life on what she called her Girl Scoutish obsession with doing worthy things. Now she would take advantage of the new lease of life that the transplant would give her and do the things that really mattered to her. Did I agree? She asked. And as she did, her eyes seemed to bore into my face. I agreed, I said. Later, back at my hotel, and for the only time during the first night after I had accompanied my mother to see Dr. A, and the day, some weeks after her death, when I finally broke down, I wept. But my stupefaction was almost as great as my grief. I kept thinking, she really does not know what is happening to her. She still believes that she's going to survive. So I have a number of reasons for quoting that passage, but not least of which is to reflect on how Sontag's denial and her desperate need to cajole her son into playing along in the dance of denial finally cost him what he considers a precious time of communion, direct communion with his dying mother. This was because, in order to fuel her pretense, he was required not to open to or share his own feelings. So he does speak more in the book about how he kept, after she died, rehearsing the conversations that he wanted to have with his mother, heart to heart, about how much she had meant to him and how he felt about losing her. But he had never been given the ground, he felt, to have those direct conversations with his mother because of the amount of effort she'd put into this veneer of refusing to accept that she was actually dying. So another reason for mentioning this particular example is that Susan Sontag is a renowned academic, a world philosopher, if you like. Her books are constantly in print and read by people around the world. Yet she could not intellectually comprehend the reality or accept the reality of what was happening to her. Even at some emotional level, she was in distress, as her son points out. She was unable to bring those two together into a reappraisal of her situation that was realistic and sort of productive going forward. So I'm not judging Susan Sontag. These situations are all too common, and I'm sure many of us have had very, very similar situations in our lives. And when I was diagnosed, I had the almost shocking experience, I think many people who are diagnosed with terminal illness have this, of having all sorts of quite weird reactions from friends and loved ones. And so often the people who you think are going to support you aren't there. And the people who didn't really think would support you are the ones who come forward in those moments. And so you question more deeply what's happening, and it's fear. It's fear on the part of the living to not only acknowledge your death or your pending death or the possibility, but their own incredible fragility. So Reith writes, I do not think, he wonders whether she might have had another chance. He says, I do not think that this was mainly because of my own fear of death, although it might have played some role. He's talking about why he didn't communicate from his side. Rather, for me, coping with accompanying my mother in her struggle, something I was determined to do, and rightly, it never occurred to her that not only I, but also her immediate circle of friends wouldn't do, meant becoming something of a stranger to myself. So Reith here is saying that in forcing to play his mother's game of denial along with his mother to keep her happy on one level, he became a stranger to himself because he couldn't be in contact with his actual process, his actual feelings, and also his mother was bestranged to him. So there's a double alienation there. So a very, very poignant, I think, treatment. He says, the description that occurred to me at the time was psychological intubation. I wanted to take up as little psychic room as possible. In being, in some sense, part of my mother's emotional life support, I found myself to be on emotional life support. That still feels appropriate to me, but looking back, I still wish that it had been otherwise. Had it been, I doubtless could have given more. At least, I would have had the means to have given more. Again, I very much doubt the specific nature of my relationship with my mother is of great significance in these regrets and afterthoughts. To the contrary, On those occasions when I've talked about these feelings with other people who have lost parents, they mostly express similar regrets, no matter how different their temperaments are from mine, or their parents from my mother's. But I have never asked any of them if they were sure that they should have lied, as somewhere I always felt that I was doing. My mother had always thought of herself as someone whose hunger for truth was absolute. After her diagnosis, the hunger remained, but it was life and not truth that she was desperate for. I hope I did the right thing in trying to give it to her, but I'll never be sure. But she was clear about what she wanted, and to the extent that I'm consolable about the role I played, this is what consoles me. She was entitled to die her own death. So I think this raises some very poignant and very profound points, and the chief of which is, how are we to accommodate the wishes of the dying and those presented with, say, a terminal diagnosis, and at the same time remain open to honest communication of our feelings that are set in a candid appraisal of the situation. So this is an ongoing question. I'm not going to seek to answer it. I'm raising it because it's a question we have to continuously work on. And I was asked by Michael last week about, how we, let's look, give some examples of, being at the side of the bedside of a dying person, how to respond. And I mentioned that it's very much an individual situation. You have to read it as it occurs, as it unfolds, and respond accordingly. And this is why His Holiness's book is so incredibly vital for us, because if we do the work now that's contained in the contents of this book, we will be able to rally, if you like, to respond to the crisis situation in the most beneficial manner possible, without regret. So this is really, really important to think of doing, not just for ourselves, but for those we might care for. So I'm not seeking to answer the question simply or give somehow a universal answer. It's a matter of drawing deeply on the reservoir and insight and empathy that we can develop towards comprehending the suffering plight of others. And this is something that we will have developed, or will be working on developing, in terms of our aspiring bodhisattva practice. As sort of Buddhists, as Mahayana Buddhists, we're aspiring to step in the steps of the Buddha to full enlightenment on behalf of suffering others. That's our chief goal. So as we do this and take step after step, our grasping at ourself as the central focus, I, this one, the self-cherishing I, is correspondingly diminished. So it's like the two scales are two arms of a scale, or the two containers of a scale. As our self-cherishing diminishes, our ability to cherish others increases, and our ability to cherish others increases, our self-cherishing is diminished. So there's a direct relationship between these two. So put another way, our ability to administer to the dying, and even to our dying selves, will be enhanced the more work we put into our spiritual transformation. And this means working on it now rather than later. In the meantime, we must remain practical and humble, because yes, we too are all too human. So I want to just point here to a book that had a big impact on me when I read it. I still have enormous respect for it. It's Guy Newland's book, A Buddhist Grief Observed. Have some of us read that book? It's, as we know, Guy Newland's one of the very, very impressive Western Tibetan academic scholars of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and has done incredibly important translation work. But this is a little very, very piercingly personal memoir of the loss of his wife, to cancer. And the book is raising the question, what is the appropriate Buddhist response to the death of your wife from cancer when you're a beautifully world-famous performing Buddhist, and what isn't? And also, what is the extent and impact of social pressures around on that occurring? So Newland says, or gives an example. He says, one woman came to me in a difficult grief after losing a parent. She made a commitment to invest to intensive religious practice with the belief that she had taken the prospect of losing her parent into account. When grief hit her hard, she was doubly tormented because she felt so bad about her parent's death. She felt like a failure as a Buddhist. So Newland's relating this story because he was also awkward when he was overwhelmed by incredibly powerful grief, that somehow he was a failed Buddhist. And so this is, really, again, I think a very, very important reflection. Just from memory, I can't find the reference now, but I was reading a biography of Yeshe Tsogyal, Padmasambhava's consort, and very, very important figure in Buddhism. And on one occasion, she was discovered sobbing by one of her female disciples. And she asked Yeshe Tsogyal with some degree of incredulity, "Why are you crying?" Meaning, aren't you enlightened? And Yeshe Tsogyal replied, "There is a time to cry. And if there's a time to cry, this is the time to cry," because she had lost someone very dear. So Newland adds this intriguing coda to his account. He says, "So it is that when someone asked me in the early months whether my familiarity with Buddha's teachings on emptiness," because he's famous for his presentations on that, "had consoled me in my grief, my reflexive answer was just no. All I could think of was that Valerie, empty or not, was definitely around here before, and now she was definitely not. And that hurts. To deny this is to miss the middle way. Those who think emptiness cancelled out this fact cannot have understood." So I won't go into sort of much elaboration, but I had my own variation on this story when I was dealing with my own illness, which at that stage was, I had the bone marrow transplant and it was successful. I'm now technically in remission and things are very good, whatever that means. But at the time when I was sort of in deep travail, I was confiding my situation to a Buddhist friend who said, "Oh, all mourning is a form of attachment." And a sort of gesture of a hand, meaning just throw that one away, throw it in the bathwater. It's a waste of time. It's a sign that you haven't come to terms with attachment. So I think Newland's saying maybe, we have to be a little bit more tender, a little bit more human, a little bit more self-compassionate and accommodating here. So if all mourning as a form of attachment was the end of the story, I think we'd be living in a very hard and mechanical place. So I'm now going to jump more directly into His Holiness's book, and on page 41 of my copy, it might be slightly out of your pagination on the ebook. His Holiness says, and I quote, "I usually think of the maximum duration of the human life as 100 years, which, when compared to the life of the planet, is very short. In brief, this brief existence should be used in such a way that it does not create pain for others. It should be committed not to destructive work, but to more constructive activities, at least to not harming others or creating trouble for them. In this way, our brief span as a tourist on this planet will be meaningful." Isn't that the most extraordinarily powerful and beautiful image? our brief span as a tourist on this planet. If a tourist visits a certain place, this is His Holiness's commentary, for a short period of time and creates more trouble, that is silly. But if as a tourist you make others happy during this short period, that is wise. When you yourself move on to your next place, you'll feel happy. If you create problems, even though you yourself do not encounter any difficulty during your stay, you will wonder what the use of your visit was. So the crunch here, and that's really the whole Buddhist path in one presentation there, is that His Holiness is asking us to live our lives ethically. And this is a problematic word, unfortunately, for many, because ethics can be seen as a kind of constraining, even prison, that is coercive and controlling and inhibiting of our personal freedom, creativity, etc., etc. But this is not the Buddhist meaning of ethics at all. There is no external moral structure being pressed into place like a cookie cutter to sort of amputate ourselves from the rest of the universe if we're being bad or good, judged accordingly. No. Ethics in this Buddhist sense is precisely what His Holiness described as observing our behaviour while on our brief stay on this planet to see whether we're harming or helping others. That is the practice of ethics, regulating our activities of body, speech and mind so that they are beneficial and are not destructive. And so I make these comments, don't I, in the space of a war-torn world. You know, it's unbelievably fraught. This little delicate planet that His Holiness is talking about us being guests on is precarious because of the unrestrained lack of ethics being practiced on both individual and communal levels. So His Holiness is really pointing us, I think, here towards really deeply understanding what it means to be living an ethical life, a life of universal responsibility. So His Holiness very precisely says, discipline, it's a word he's using, discipline, does not mean prohibition. Rather, it means that when there is a contraction between long-term and short-term interests, you sacrifice the short-term for the sake of long-term benefit. This is self-discipline, which stems from ascertaining the cause and effect of karma. So this opens us out to His Holiness's presentation of the three scopes of practice. The minimum scope, as we know from our study of Lam-Rim, is that we practice not for the happiness of this life, the immediate short-term benefit, but for the benefit of the next life. And then the intermediate scope, which is a step up, is that we don't practice for the benefit of our future life, but we seek to obtain separation from the whole entire compulsive wheel of psychic existence of being thrown again and again into states of suffering. And the great scope, which is the sort of fulfillment of our bodhicitta aim, is to obtain liberation for the benefit of others, recognizing the suffering that others are continually undergoing. And so it's this framework that is giving us the kind of arena in which we act ethically and judge ourselves, become self-aware of our actions. So even a simple act, I use the word simple, of bending over and rescuing an earthworm from a footpath puddle after a heavy bout of rain is an act of incredible kindness that will also benefit the planet, benefit others. But from a bodhicitta point of view, from a great scope point of view, if we connect that simple act to a wish that all beings who are currently undergoing dangerous circumstances, such as floods and so forth, and maybe are in danger of dying, may they be taken to a safe place where they could fully recover and live their lives and so forth. And so in that way, we transform the simple act of saving the worm, which we're also doing, by the way. We haven't not saved the worm, but we're using that as a pivot to produce a very vast aspirational prayer for all beings to benefit. And so in my own case, when I save earthworms, not just earthworms, but it's a practice one can do often when you go for a walk, for example, with your dog. You suddenly have an opportunity to save a life. And I make a prayer that may this become the causes for my gurus to live long lives, because their preciousness in the world is so essential. And so in this way, our practice becomes very large, and it also creates a karmic, as His Holiness will talk about karma here, that little simple act in the present moment has karmic potentials that will unfold in future lives, not just to rescue others from danger, which is the concordant karmic result of that action of saving the worm, but also creates the causes to meet with our teachers again, which is so precious for our progress on the Buddha's path. So you can see here that this little act becomes incredibly significant. So in his book on sort of generating bodhicitta in daily life, Khabje Zopa Rinpoche gives many, many examples of this kind of way of practicing. And he says, when we open the door to go to the next room in the house, may we open the door to liberation and freedom from suffering for all sentient beings. And as we strut through the door, may I take personal responsibility for doing this with all my actions of body, speech, and mind. So you can see here that our modus operandi is being transformed. So His Holiness lays out the need for our broadening perspective with the following words. He says, from a Buddhist perspective, the highest of all aims is to achieve Buddhahood in order to be capable of helping a vast number of sentient beings. However, a medium level of achievement can liberate you from the painful round of birth, aging, sickness, and death. A lower, but still valuable level of achievement is the improvement of your future lives. So His Holiness is giving the three scopes here in reverse order. From the gradual improvement of your lives, liberation can be obtained, and based on this, eventually Buddhahood can be obtained. So it's not that we just practice the third scope and ditch the other two. There's a kind of cumulative effect. We actually practice the three simultaneously from a Mahayana perspective. But for example, our compassion that we need to generate genuine bodhicitta in order to qualify as a great scope practitioner can't be realized unless we understand how others are suffering. And we can't understand how others are suffering if we just look at the short-term situation or the immediate situation. We have to go very deeply into the fundamental causes of suffering itself, which leads us back to innate self-grasping ignorance, which then gives rise to self-cherishing, on the basis of which we create karma, afflicted karma, which has the potential to throw us into renewed states of psychic existence and so forth. And then the reason why we find that difficult to understand is because we're preoccupied with immediate affairs all the time, and sensual enjoyments or their opposites. And we try to weave between the two endlessly and ingeniously, and it's a full-time occupation. And if we're living the world with that very tight framework, we're not able to see even the suffering of our neighbour, let alone come to terms with some of these more expansive awarenesses of the plight of others. So the three are necessary to consider together. So we have to upgrade our motivation, and we need to do this in a progressive evolutionary manner. So I wanted to now just do together a meditation, which we've all done before, but it's really very important to come to terms with this classic 9-point Buddhist meditation on death and dying, because it really leads back to the point that David Reith made about his mother, that she just couldn't accept that she was dying. And we say to ourselves, oh, I'm a Buddhist, Yeah, I've done death and impermanence. I've done those meditations. What are you going to tell me now? I need something new. But no, that's not what's being meant at all. We have to do these meditations repeatedly, and so that they're opening the door continuously to the way we experience our affairs. And I know this from my own side, the need to do this, because when I was really so ill that taking a step outside was a huge effort, and to get to the corner of the street, which is 4 or 5 houses away, was almost dizzyingly difficult to accomplish. I had a very, very acute awareness of my fragility, my impermanence. And because of that, I stopped buying clothes. It sounds a really strange thing to say, but it just hit me one day that I was no longer shopping in the same way, because it suddenly occurred to me that what was the point of shopping if I wasn't going to be there to wear the shoes? And so that seems like a trivial example, but it's an example actually that's very valuable, because it gives us an idea of how we unconsciously assume our permanence, even while claiming to be intellectually aware of our impermanence. So this becomes very clear when we do the meditation. So I'm going to suggest we do this as a reflective meditation now, and I'm going to lead the meditation, and I'm basing it on a presentation from the Mind Training collection, a very precious book, which is published by Wisdom Publications, and it's a collection of Lojong thought transformation teachings, which is also a source of many of the commentaries that our own precious teachers give. So it's found on pages 439 to 455. So I'm not giving the complete meditation, but it shows you how big it is. I'm just giving a kind of an extract of that. So let's just spend a moment becoming aware of ourselves in our current sitting position. So we bring the mind inwards. Maybe observe the breath for a few cycles. We prepare the motivation for the meditation, which is we're not just doing this to become aware of our own impermanence and inevitable death, but in order to transform ourselves so that we can take full advantage of the opportunities that are arising from moment to moment to benefit others and overcome the self-cherishing attitude that's blocking us from any sense of universal responsibility or care. So in the meditation, the first contemplation is, these days when people discuss things, they say that they do this or that and will do this and that unless they die first. Such statements are utterly misguided. We must keep death, who will definitely come, deep in our guts. If we think that maintaining the thought, unless I die first, I will do this or that, is to keep death in your guts, this is wrong. Keeping death deep in your guts means making preparations from this very instant for a positive death by reflecting, I know that death is certain to come. So I will, with conviction in my own mortality, make sure to experience death in such and such manner. In other words, we make preparation. It's been stated, the end of meeting is separation, the end of hoarding is depletion, the end of growth is decay, and the end of birth is death. Dispelling Sorrow Sutra states, have you ever seen or heard of or harbored speculations of someone, whether on earth or in the heavens, who was born but did not die? So cast your mind back and list all the people who you have known who have died. You might even want to start with our immediate family and spread out. Now consider that in the future, it is definite that someone will be able to add our name to their list. So far as the Lord of Death is concerned, no means whatsoever exists to avert him. You can escape from eternal enemies by running away or moving to a place that is free of them. As for the Lord of Death, however, you cannot escape him even by running very quickly. Neither can you reach a place where he is absent. It is stated, even great sages with 5 types of clairvoyance, who can venture afar in the vast skies, cannot journey even if they wish to a place free of death. So the next part of the contemplation that death is certain is thinking how nothing is being added to your lifespan and it is always being subtracted from. So various analogies are given. It is like a prisoner. We are like a prisoner on death row. Each day brings us closer, inevitably, to our execution date. We're like a pond whose source has dried up. Each day there is less water in the pond. We're like a sheep in a butcher's corral. Sheep come into the corral through one gate and leave it for their death through the other. There's no escape. And like a torrential river pouring down the face of a steep mountain. We have less and less minutes left to us in this life as time rushes by. Not one of those drops of water rushing down the cliff can be regained. So thinking now about how definitely we'll die before we get around to practicing Dharma. Imagine that a cluster of grass grows hidden somewhere in the crevice of a steep cliff, and a person falling off the cliff manages to grab onto this cluster of grass. However, black and white rodents are taking turns nibbling at the grass. If the person strives hard before the grass is completely eaten away, he or she might be able to pull themselves up to safety. If, on the other hand, we procrastinate until the grass is eaten, we will definitely fall off the cliff. Since no one is outside the boundary of death, there's no room for thoughts of laziness and procrastination such as, there will be a time later, and I shall do this and that then. In the case of ourselves, we are hanging precariously at the mouth, on the face of a cliff, at the mouth of the lower realms, and we are holding onto the grass of what is left of our lifespan. If we do not demonstrate our vigor and make an effort, and if the grass of our remaining lifespan disappears and we fall into the gorge of the lower realms, there is no escape. Therefore, we have to strive with all our effort. So we apply this to our daily activities, and because it's an ancient text, they're connected to horse riding. For example, when you ride an attractive mount, think, reflect. Today I may be riding an attractive mount such as this, yet a time will come when I'll be transported by a corpse handler. When you wash yourself, reflect. Today I may be taking hygienic care through such acts as washing, yet a day will come when my own waste will be smeared over my body and I'll be discarded in an unclear environment such as a cemetery. By means of these various contemplations, meditate until a deep sense of conviction arises concerning the inevitability of death. So now we think of the uncertainty of when we'll die. And the first contemplation is that the lifespan of people from the southern continent, the one we live on, is not fixed. And this is especially so of people in these degenerate times. When I was doing this contemplation the other day, I thought of a building next to my house, not immediately next, but in the same suburb, which is a hospice for children. It has a giant pink elephant money bank parked out the front for donations to the hospice. Some people think that they will pursue mundane goals early in life and only engage in Dharma practice in later life. Others think that this year they'll gain favourable conditions such as provisions, and then from next year on, they'll practice Dharma. Such plans are realized only rarely. It is difficult to determine which of the two, next year or next life, will come first. It is difficult even to determine which of the two, next month or next life, next day or next life, will appear first. This is because your lifespan is not guaranteed. The Dispelling Sorrow Sutra states, some will die in the womb, likewise some instantly after birth, some when they start to crawl, some when they are able to sprint, some die in old age and some in youth, some die when they are in their prime, like the falling of ripened fruits. In turn, everyone will depart. Shanti Davis says, to live confidently with the thought, I'll not die today, is unwise. Without doubt, the time will come when this self will be no more. Although this is certain, you may continue to inspire hope and that makes you feel that you will not die for some time. For example, we might feel that we're young and free of illness at present, and we've gathered many amenities for sustenance, such as food, clothing, and so on. And some of us are very fortunate to also be free of threats from enemies or malevolent forces. Because of this, we feel, I will not die for a long time. But if we investigate, none of these factors justifies such confidence. Youth, for example, cannot justify this confidence. For many young people who are stronger die before older people who are at the stage when they need to rely on others. This is an observed fact. The collection of aphorisms states, of the many people we see in the morning, in the evening we do not see some. Of the many people we see in the evening, in the morning we do not see some. If many men and women die while in their prime, why are you certain that I will live because I'm young? So another reason why the time of death is uncertain is because there are many factors contributing towards our death and few contributing towards our life. The Precious Garland states, like an oil lamp in the midst of a storm, we stand in the midst of death's causes. And a letter to a student states, like the flame of a lamp flickering due to a violent wind, there is no certainty this life will remain even for an instant. There are innumerable circumstances that can cause death. The four external elements, fire, earth, air, and water, for example, can become conditions for death. The conflict between the four internal elements cause illness and can act as a cause of death. Humans, such as enemies and friends, can become a cause of death. So can other classes of sentient beings, such as animals. Furthermore, what are considered factors for sustaining life, such as our house, our family, our food and clothing, can become conditions for death as well. Even your own self, which is dear to you, can cause your death. You have seen and heard of unimaginable situations where these factors have turned into conditions of death. There are no flawless reasons for believing that although these factors may have been conditions for the death of our teachers, they will not act as such for us. So we contemplate in the following manner: nothing among the internal and external phenomena of this world can be excluded as a potential cause of death. It is impossible to escape to a place that is without the conditions of death, and each condition is individually capable of causing death as well. Furthermore, there is no guarantee that I will not encounter one of these circumstances. So I could die today or tomorrow. I must therefore engage in perfect Dharma practice. And when we'll die is also uncertain because our body is quite insignificant. This is because the separation of our mind and body can occur extremely easily. In other words, the link between our mind and our body in this life is more fragile than bubbles of water. Nagarjuna states, if life has many adversities and is more transient than water bubbles blown by a storm, amazing indeed it is that we inhale after exhaling and that we wake up after going to sleep. Thus, I should have no confidence that I will not die even before the sun sets. Were I somehow to die today or tomorrow, I would have failed to accomplish any task that requires keeping the awareness of death deep in my guts. Alas, what would happen to me after death? I therefore resolve today, I will let go of this life. From today onward, I'll instead undertake Dharma practice that is beneficial for the time of death. So the third main contemplation in this meditation is the fact that only spiritual insight can help at the time of death. So we analyze your possessions and enjoyments cannot help. In A Guide to a Bodhisattva's Way of Life, Shantideva says, when seized by Yama's messengers, what good is a relative? What good is a friend? Also, though I may lie in my bed, surrounded by all my family and friends, I alone must endure the experience of my life being snapped. Similarly, however abundant your material resources are, such as food, cattle, and wealth, none will be of any use. You cannot buy even a short amount of time by making gifts to the Lord of Death. It is impossible to extend your lifespan by even a moment. Not even a small part of it can be taken to the other shore. Similarly, whatever desirable qualities associated with the 8 worldly concerns you may possess, such as forceful speech, fawnable authority, and so on, they'll be of no help and might in fact do you more harm. A Guide to a Bodhisattva's Way of Life states, I have great wealth and I am honoured. There are many who adore me. If you harbour such conceited thoughts, terror will strike you following your death. For the mind that is thoroughly deluded, whatever things it becomes attached to, by many thousandfold, all these will rise as suffering. And the sutra entitled Advice to a King states, O great king, at that point and at such time, There is no refuge or protector other than the Dharma. So, what is the benefit at this time? If you have engaged in a perfect Dharma practice, this will help. A guide to a bodhisattva's way of life states, if at that time it is merit alone that saves. So the second contemplation, your loved ones cannot help. This is true, and if they're clutching at our bodies, asking us not to leave. And at death time, even our body cannot help. No matter how we might have cared for our body, protected and preserved it, exercised it, fed it well, and so forth, there will be a point when we cannot rely on our body to rescue us from death. So the advice to a king states, at that point and at such a time, it is the Dharma that is your refuge, your protector, your support, your locus, and your great ally. If the thought occurs that even if you practice Dharma, you're still going to die, understand that there are differences in the manner of dying and so on. Death is inevitable, there is no certainty of its time, and only the Dharma is of help in the face of it. It is therefore extremely inappropriate to remain unperturbed with the confidence of someone who has no fear of death. A guide to a bodhisattva's way of life states, who will grant me fearlessness? If it is beyond doubt that there is no escape from it whatsoever, how can my mind remain in peace? And Aryadeva's 400 stanzas states, among those who rule over the three worlds, none can be their own lord of death. If knowing this, you still sleep peacefully, what is more unbecoming than this? And Yangongpa advises, those with courage should ensure their own long-term welfare without deceiving yourself. Practice Dharma, sacred Dharma, from your depth. So His Holiness, that's the completion of the meditation. And when I say completed, it's not completed because we have to do it repeatedly. And it's a matter of dwelling with it. And His Holiness really does emphasize in his commentary that our purpose in doing this meditation, which might shock some people to hear that we meditate in this fashion, is not in any way whatsoever morbid. In fact, he argues the precise opposite, that if we don't become aware of death and impermanence, we won't have any freshness and vitality and sort of sharpness of outlook at all. We'll live in a kind of fantasy that's always going to come unstuck in a very, very difficult and probably traumatic way. So His Holiness asks us to be mindful of death repeatedly. And he says, you have to be concerned with the deeper aspects of life that affect future lives before understanding the full nature of suffering and psychic existence. This understanding of suffering in turn is required for the full development of compassion. So again, His Holiness has given the whole Buddha's path to enlightenment in one paragraph, because he's saying that if we're still preoccupied to clinging onto this life, then we're not even doing Dharma practice. So not only are we unprepared, but we're not in any way generating positive karma or momentum going forward. And if we're practicing for future lives and escaping from the psychic existence, that is very, very good. but we have to see it in terms of its role as the foundation for the development of love and compassion that are going to lead us to enlightenment. Because we can only generate genuine renunciation that steps back from clinging to the affairs of this life if we've recognized death and impermanence, the sufferings of psychic existence, the suffering of others, and therefore have generated a compassion that is very robust, very, very anchored in reality the first time. So His Holiness, and I think this is, if I only do one thing in these 4 talks, just to stress this one little seed of thought, really. His Holiness says that awareness of death and impermanence should be understood as a crucial, and these are His Holiness's words, motivating factor. In a sense, we can even propose that awareness of death and impermanence is healthy because it is creative. His Holiness says it is beneficial to be aware that you will die. Why? If you are not aware of death, you will not be mindful of your practice. You'll just spend your time, your life meaninglessly, not examining what sorts of attitudes and actions perpetuate suffering and what bring happiness. If you have a strong sense of the certainty of death and of the uncertainty of the time of its arrival, so you can see here how His Holiness is referring to the classic 9-point meditation we've just shared together, you'll be motivated from within. It will be as if a friend is cautioning, be careful, be earnest, another day is passing. However, His Holiness continues, if you do not wait until the end for that knowledge that you will die to sink in, and you realistically assess your situation now, you will not be overwhelmed by superficial temporary purposes. You will not neglect what matters in the long run. So I think, again, if we're being practical, Buddhists, and human, all too human again, His Holiness isn't saying that in giving up attachment to this life that we somehow ignore it and just sit down and constantly make prayers on a cushion. He's referring to a much more radical proposition that we begin to realign ourselves to our experience as things unfold, so that we're no longer immediately sucked in to the fantasy that all of our accomplishments and wishes are going to be achieved by clinging to short-term pleasures or seeking to avoid short-term sort of displeasures. And we're going to have a much broader focus, outlook, and we're going to approach it with a motivating force, which is to utilize the conditions that we're meeting with towards this greater ethical sort of project that His Holiness has described early on. And so this is a completely different way of living, and it's radically different, profoundly different way of living. So His Holiness says, and I've called this the crunch of this passage, really, it is better to decide from the beginning that you will die and investigate what is worthwhile. If you keep in mind how quickly this life disappears, you will value your time and do what is valuable. With a strong sense of the imminence of death, you'll feel the need to engage in spiritual practice, improving your mind, and will not waste your time in various distractions, ranging from eating and drinking to endless talk about war, romance, and gossip. We must build up productive habits now. His Holiness says the essential purpose of these reflections, as I said, they're not morbid, because they are to generate, I quote, a powerful, virtuous motivation at the time of death to fortify and activate various dispositions that lead us to a favorable rebirth. So there's a lot to be said about this. But His Holiness is saying that if we practice in this way now, we'll know exactly what to do at the time of death. So now is the time to practice and prepare. So this leads us now to the rest of the book, because it unfolds very rapidly from this point on in terms of commentary, because His Holiness is giving a verse-by-verse direct commentary on a poem by the first Panchen Lama, Losang Chökyi Gyaltsen, who's also the author of our Lama Chopa or Guru Puja practice, which we do often, many of us will do in our practices, daily practices and so forth. And the prayer is called Wishes for Release from the Perilous Straits of the Intermediate State, here releasing from fright. So some of the verses have a chapter to themselves, and on some occasion there are several verses given in the chapter, and some of the chapters are quite brief and some are much more extensive. So His Holiness introduces the poem's significance, and I've also made the poem available for everyone, by the way. I think you probably got it. I sent out the poem as a PDF with the structure of His Holiness gave superimposed or interpolated into the structure of the poem. So the importance of the poem is, in order to be freed from frightful straits, such as being beset by robbers, thugs, or wild animals, you need a heroic and capable guide to save you. Similarly, to be liberated from the terror of illusory appearances while dying and during the intermediate state between lives, you'll need to practice the advice offered in this poem, which provides profound techniques for release from those fears. So you can see here that His Holiness has brought us right up to the moment in our own unfolding experience when we're confronting our actual death. So this is incredibly precious advice. It's not advice that we're getting in the world at large, how to prepare at that moment, is it normally? By reflecting on the poem, His Holiness says, you'll learn how death occurs, knowledge that will be useful during the actual process. Dying is a time when the deepest levels of mind manifest themselves. Daily reflection also opens the door to those states. So we're going to have more to say on that, but His Holiness is referring here to the innate clear light mind. And at the time of death, we go through a series of dissolutions, which are described in the later chapters of the book. And we eventually arise as what's called the clear light of death, the most subtle mind in our continuum. And it will continue into the immediate state. And then if we have the karmic cause and conditions, will be connected to another body, or the germs of another body in another existence. And then as those organs of that body develop, we'll regain sensory consciousness and outer consciousness and so forth, in the sense it will become aware of our external environment and so forth, independent on our body. So it's an incredibly profound topic to explore this. But in Buddhist Tantra, techniques are given in meditation to work towards reaching a direct contact, if you like, with that clear light mind, that subtle clear light mind, prior to our actual death, so that when we reach a death process, we can marry, if you like, or mate our clear light mind that we've generated in meditation with the actual mind of clear light that's arising due to the death dissolutions. And this provides an extraordinary moment to arise in the intermediate state, not in a form of an afflicted body, but if we're being practicing Tantra as a deity, as a Buddhist deity. And so I, that arises in the intermediate state, am Tara, I am Chenrezig, I am Chakrasamvara, I am Haruka, or whatever, Yamantaka, whatever practice that we've concentrated on in our lifetime. So this is one of the reasons why we talk about yidams in Buddhism. We find a tantric deity with which we have a deep resonance and rapport, and we practice that in many, many ways. But in particular, we can also practice it by taking the three ordinary states of birth, death, and the bardo into the path as causes to ensure our progression into the next life. So this is sort of reaching ahead to the end of the book. So the account of the death process that follows is indeed vital, as without it, we're unable to position ourselves skillfully and act in accordance with the flow of the death process itself. So in other words, we greet the arising appearances of the death process with familiarity because we've rehearsed them in meditation. In other words, we don't have to resist the arising of those states. We can actually go with them. We've got no choice to go with them because that person's going to die, whether they like to or not, because the disillusions are occurring. But if we're a meditator, we've trained, we can actually, if you like, ride the winds of that process and actually utilize them transformatively in meditation. These are referring to the most extraordinary techniques, if you like, meditation techniques in the Mahayana Mahayana Buddhist tradition. They're not exclusively Tibetan, they're all rooted in the Buddhist teachings and stemming from India. So this enables us to utilize our deepest levels of mind, which we can't normally access due to the gross domination of our senses. And so it's interesting, isn't it? Even sleep is an example of a more subtle consciousness than our sensual, waking, organ-based sensual consciousness. And we're able to visualize all sorts of things and realms in a dream state that aren't available to us in our waking state. So this is just sort of a clue as to the kind of capacities that we have to see things completely differently, dependent upon the level of mind that is being generated. So in other words, Tantra, as Lama Yeshe describes very beautifully in his introduction to Tantra, is based on the idea that if we can manipulate by using technology, he calls it, a sort of mind technology, the levels of consciousness that are arising, we can actually bring about a transformation of the world, the realities that are appearing to us in a way that's inexplicable from the constrained perspective of a gross state of consciousness. So I just sort of throw that out. In this way, we prepare ourselves for the actual death process, and the meaning of this will become clearer as His Holiness's explanation proceeds. But His Holiness says the essential purpose of doing all this is to empower us to, quote, generate a powerful, virtuous motivation at the time of death to fortify and activate various dispositions which lead us to a favorable rebirth. In this way, we're positioned to continue as spiritual practitioners, to continue our spiritual practice. So for advanced, or particularly advanced meditators, by utilizing tantric methods, we can even attain enlightenment in the enlightened, in the intermediate state. So these methods are taught secretly in highest yoga tantra, and the reason they're secret, I thought probably a number of reasons, but one of them is not just some people like holding secrets, it makes them special. It's because we are dealing with the very most subtle dimensions of our mind and its relationship to subtle energies that accompany it, and that we don't play with those lightly. And so we need a whole framework, coherent framework in which to perform these practices. So His Holiness cautions, when death actually comes, if you're not used to this practice, adjusted according to our awareness of each stage of the death process, it will be very difficult to be successful at any beneficial reflection. Therefore, now is the time to practice and prepare. So what is required, says His Holiness, is to institute a continuous practice of reflection on the process of death and the intermediate state between lives. Imagining the steps so that they become familiar. This is very important, for then you will achieve success in keeping with your greatest capacity. And I seized on this idea of greatest capacity because it refers, I think, to our Buddha nature, which is our own inner potential to become fully enlightened for the benefit of others. And His Holiness doesn't underestimate the amount of effort we must make to discover this sort of Buddha nature. And he also says, mere knowledge of the process of death and practices concerned in it are not sufficient. You must gain familiarity with them over months and years. So to give an overview of the poem, I'll now read the poem, and you might like to read along with me if you've got it there, I think. If you have, it doesn't matter, I can read. If you show it on the screen, that'd be great. It was a separate PDF file, but it's also available in the book itself. His Holiness explains how we can understand the poem structure. So I'm going to read His Holiness's description of the poem structure and then the verses. Fantastic, thank you. So the sections in red are His Holiness's structural outline, and then the numbered verses are the actual stanzas. So I'll simply read through it, but it's yeah. The first 7 stanzas explain how to approach dying. First, an initial stanza about taking refuge in Buddha, his doctrine, and the spiritual community. And this is, I just put in brackets, explained in chapter 2. I and all beings throughout space and without exception go for refuge until the ultimate of enlightenments. The past, present, and future Buddhas, the doctrine, and the spiritual community may be released from the frights of this life, the intermediate state, and the next. His Holiness, the next 2 stanzas, sorry, we need to go back a little bit, we've jumped too far. There we go. The next 2 stanzas, chapter 3, address the importance of valuing the present lifetime as an opportunity for spiritual practice. They describe how to make use of this precious situation by reflecting on the impermanence of the present in order to undermine our excessive attachment to fleeting experiences. The verses, may we extract the meaningful essence of this life support without being distracted by the senseless affairs of this life. Since this good foundation, hard to gain and easy to disintegrate, presents an opportunity of choice between profit and loss, comfort and misery. May we realize that there is no time to waste, death being definite, but the time of death indefinite. What is gathered will separate, what has been accumulated will be consumed without residue. At the end of arising comes descent, the finality of birth is death. And stanzas 4 and 5, His Holiness comments, this is corresponding to chapter 4. Speak to adopting a perspective that can handle both the overwhelming suffering that can accompany the time near death and the delusions that appear while dying. So I just want to mention here while I'm covering the structure that the evolution of the verses, as His Holiness is so clearly pointing out, is also describing the sort of biographical unfolding of our own death experience and giving appropriate instructions for each stage of that process. So that's why it's so important to read this book with that structure kept very clearly in mind, because it has an incredible import and a significance in terms of how we're going to be able to manage the death process. So stanzas 4 and 5 I've read that out at the moment. Yeah. Stanzas 4 and 5 speak to adopting a perspective that can handle both the overwhelming suffering that accompany the timely death and the delusions that appear while dying. May we be relieved from overwhelming suffering due to the various causes of death, when in this city of erroneous conceptions of subject and object, the illusory body composed of the four impure elements and consciousness are about to separate. May we be relieved from mistaken appearances of non-virtue, when, deceived at the time of need by this body sustained so dearly, the frightful enemies, the lords of death, manifest, and we kill ourselves with the weapons of the three poisons of lust, hatred, and bewilderment. Stanzas 5, 6, and 7 prescribe how to achieve the most favourable conditions for death by remembering what to practice and by remaining joyful. May we remember instructions for practice when doctors forsake us and rights are of no avail. Friends have given up hope for our life and we are left with nothing else to do. May we have the confidence of joy and delight when food and wealth accumulated with miserliness are left behind, and we separate forever from cherished and longed for friends, alone going to a perilous situation. So the next three stanzas, which correspond to chapter 6, describe at length the appearances that occur during the first four stages of dying and how to meditate throughout them. This section calls on our knowledge of the collapse of the physical elements that support consciousness and their corresponding experiences. So you can see here now that we've gone beyond that probably clinical, well, we're heading into that fringe realm from a hospital perspective of being actually clinically dead. So I won't say more on that at the moment because, particularly you have to be very, very precise in how you talk about that. But we're moving even closer to the point where we're going to be separating from our body. May we generate a powerful mind of virtue when the elements earth, water, fire, and wind dissolve in stages and physical strength is lost, mouth and nose dry and pucker, warmth withdraws, breaths are gasped, and rattling sounds emerge. May we realize the deathless mode of being when various mistaken appearances, frightful and horrible, and in particular mirage, smoke, and fireflies appear, and the mounts of the 80 indicative conceptions cease. May we generate strong mindfulness and introspection when the wind constituent begins to dissolve into consciousness and the external continuum of breath ceases. Coarse dualistic appearances dissolve and the appearance like a burning butter lamp dawns. This is probably the moment that would correspond to clinical death from a perspective of breathing. His Holiness, these dissolutions and their corresponding experiences gradually open the way for three deeper, subtlest minds to manifest themselves, as described in the following stanza, chapter 7. This chapter lays out the structure of mind and body according to highest yoga tantra. May we know our own mind natures through the yoga, realizing psychic existence and nirvana as empty. When appearances increase and near attainment dissolve, the earlier into the latter, and experiences like pervasive moonlight, sunlight, and darkness dawn. Stanzas 12 and 13, corresponding to chapter 8, address the culminating experience of the fundamental innate mind of clear light. This innermost level of mind is the basis of all conscious life. May the mother and child clear lights meet, when near attainment dissolves into the all empty and all conceptual multiplications cease and an experience like the autumn sky free from polluting conditions dawns. May we be set in one pointed, profound meditation in the exalted wisdom of joined innate wisdom and emptiness during the four empties upon the melting of the moonlight white constituent by the fire of the lightning like powerful female. And the four last stanzas, and corresponding to chapter 9 and 10, describe the intermediate state after death, this is from a Buddhist perspective, and before the next life, and show how to react to the often horrific events that can occur during this state. They detail how various levels of practitioners can seek to direct their ensuring rebirth, end quote. May we complete in place of the intermediate state the concentration meditation of illusion, so that upon leaving the clear light, we arise in a body of complete enjoyment, blazing with the glory of a Buddha's marks and beauties, arisen from the mere wind and mind, it should be, of the clear light of death. If, due to karma, an intermediate state is established, may erroneous appearances be purified through immediately analysing and realising the absence of inherent existence, of the sufferings of birth, death, and the intermediate state. May we be born in a pure land, through the yoga transforming the external, internal, and secret, when various signs, false sounds of the reversal of the elements, three frightful appearances and uncertainties appear. May we be reborn with the supreme life support of a tantric practitioner, using the sky or the body of a monastic or lay practitioner, or the body of a monastic or lay practitioner possessing the three practices, and may we complete the realizations of the path of the two stages of generation and completion, thereby becoming a Buddha's bodies, truth, complete enjoyment, and emanation. So in Holiness concludes, together, these 17 stanzas present the full scope of preparation for death by removing unfavorable conditions, gaining favorable conditions, learning how to engage in spiritual practice while dying, learning how to handle the intermediate state between lives, and influencing the subsequent rebirth. So with this, we're in position to look at the content of chapter 2, which we're not able to do now because we've run out of time. But I think we're very well poised, I might say, to venture into the rest of the book. So I'm quite happy with where we are. And it becomes very clear as the commentary on the individual chapters unfolds that His Holiness is keeping very, very precisely to this evolutionary notion of how we approach an actual experience of dying. So these are probably the most remarkable instructions that we'll ever receive. And so they're to be treasured and really seen as the basis of a very, very profound and secure practice. So I'm going to leave the commentary there, and I just think probably is 5 minutes or 10 minutes all right for questions? We've run over time a little bit. Is that all right, or are you happy just to finish? It's up to you.
Anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? And there aren't any online.
No, that's fine, because you know, I've thrown out a lot of information and a lot of food for thought, and I can't apologize for that because the topic itself is demanding such an approach. And so I hope we're all seizing the opportunity of embracing the need for that sort of complex, interwoven presentation. So I'd like to thank everyone very much for spending time together tonight. I have prepared the next talk, and I find that we get well into the text in the third presentation, and we'll have time in the fourth presentation to touch upon some of the very profound descriptions and aspects that are being discussed in the later verses of the poem. So I think in that way we'll hopefully together do justice to the book. But I think these evenings together, stay here, are really a bit like a book club, really. It's an invitation to think that this book is going to be an absolute prized possession for life, and that we're going to hold it very closely to our hearts, and to see it as a practice manual. So with that in mind, we'll dedicate the merits of the session. So the dedication prayers. Thank you. So Thanksgiving mandala. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. May my venerable Lama's life be firm, his white divine actions spread in the 10 directions. May the torch of the teachings of Losang always remain, dispelling the darkness of all beings in the 3 realms. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And the long life prayers. May this, yes, long life for His Holiness first. I think it must be 1 page back. There we go. Thank you. The wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And the long life prayer for Lama Zopa Rinpoche. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as a bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunat's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplished the magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels, Saviour of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. We also make long life prayers for our other precious teachers. We can also dedicate towards those who are facing illness and death, or death at this very moment, that they might experience death in a positive way and achieve happy rebirths leading towards greater and greater happiness in future times, right up until full enlightenment. And that we'll take personal responsibility for holding their hand. So I might just as a sort of parting few words, I had the fortune of being in India for the anniversary of Lama Tsongkhapa's death a couple of years ago, the great anniversary. And His Holiness said to the auditorium there, he'd spent some time greeting the elderly as he came into the room, and he said, not for us not to worry, because at the time of death, Chenrezig would reach out his hand and lead us by the hand. So there was no reason to fear. So I found this incredibly moving, of course, incredibly beautiful thing to say. But it's also, if we practice according to the instructions in this book, we are really preparing ourselves to be led into these transformative states in the most remarkable way. So we will also be led by Chenrezig, the Buddha of compassion, in this way. So I just leave us with this rather wonderful image. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to seeing you